On March the 5th, 1770, a violent clash broke out between a regiment of British soldiers and a group of young men in Boston known as the Patriots. The soldiers were being pelted with snowballs and rocks. Within an hour, 5 young men had been shot dead. This event became known throughout the colonies as the Boston Massacre. It symbolized the growing tensions between the colonists and their British masters, which had intensified in recent years due to increased taxes on the colonies. Most Boston lawyers refused to defend the British soldiers. John Adams, a young Boston lawyer, decided to defend them. He believed in the principle of equal justice for all, and that all citizens had a right to justice before the law. Adams was born 35 years earlier in Braintree, Massachusetts. His father was a farmer and wealthy New York merchant. John was taught privately as a child and later attended Harvard University. Here he studied literature and law and was an outstanding student. He had already established a strong reputation as a lawyer, defending Boston business people against illegal searches of their premises by the time of the Boston Massacre. He defended the soldiers in this case with a high degree of legal skill and got all of them except one acquitted. In the early 1770s, tensions and violence continued to exist between the colonists and their British superiors. In 1773, the incident known as the Boston Tea Party inflamed passions further. A group of patriots boarded a ship in Boston Harbour and threw the equivalent of about $1 million worth of tea overboard into the sea rather than pay tax on it. The British government responded with new measures known as the Intolerable Acts, which were intended to punish the colony of Massachusetts and the city of Boston in particular. These measures had the effect of bringing the colonies closer together, with leading rebels such as Samuel Adams created resistance to British rule throughout the colonies with a clever leafleting and propaganda campaign. By September 1774, a Continental Congress was convened to meet in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies attended this Congress. They discussed their collective response to the increased taxation and also to the growing British oppression that was continuing throughout the colonies. At first, Adams advocated a moderate stand, hoping to organise a boycott on British imports unless the Intolerable Acts were repealed. This set of proposals were known as the Suffolk Reserves. Events moved quickly, however. Clashes between the Patriots and the British Army continued. As the Congress progressed, the early stages of the Revolutionary War had already begun. Delegates began to realise a clash with the British was inevitable. If it was to be successful, it needed to be organised from the top. John Adams proposed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army with this in mind. Throughout 1774 and 1775, John Adams moved from being a moderate to a more radical political position. He was influenced by the writings of Benjamin Franklin, and by the middle of 1775, Adams himself had written a book entitled A Framework for Republican Constitutions. Here he outlined his own republican philosophy. Essentially, Adams had become a radical and now believed in the separation of the two nations and the cause of United States independence from Britain. By June 1776, he had become chairman of a small group in the Congress known as the Committee of Five, which included Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Adams was an extremely busy man, sitting on dozens of different committees in the Congress, and he was chairman of over 25 of them. He delegated the writing of the Declaration of Independence to Jefferson. This document subsequently became one of the most influential political statements in the history of the world. The Continental Congress of 74 and 75 also produced the original Constitution, known as the Articles of Confederation. This Constitution worked reasonably well during the war years, but was subsequently found to be inadequate and needed to be revised. Throughout the Revolutionary War, Adams was chairman of the Board of War. In this position, he was in constant touch with leading army commanders like Washington, helping to organize money, equipment, and supplies wherever they were needed. By November 77, Adams was appointed Commissioner to France. Here he played a leading role in developing the alliance between the French and the colonies, and this played a very important role with the French bombardment of Yorktown in 1781, which concluded the war. By March 1779, Adams left France, and the following year he focused on working on the Constitution of Massachusetts, his home state. He is considered the primary author of this constitution, which is the oldest functioning constitution in the world. It helped to create a model upon which the United States Constitution was based a number of years later. Following the victory at Yorktown in 1781, Adams was appointed as ambassador to the Dutch Republic, and as a leading US diplomat throughout Europe, he continued to gain recognition for the new nation from many of the great European powers. By 1783, Adams was a leading figure in negotiating the Treaty of Paris. This treaty, in effect, officially ended the war between the United States and Britain. It also established the United States as an independent nation. This was probably John Adams's greatest single political achievement. By 1785, Adams was appointed ambassador to Great Britain, where he met King George on a number of occasions and helped to normalize relations between the two countries in the aftermath of the war. A few years later, by 1788, at the age of 54, Adams had returned to America and become vice president as a result of a vote of the Electoral College. There was no popular elections at that time. He got 33 votes, well behind George Washington, but this entitled him to the position of vice president. During Washington's first term, Adams was largely ignored by the president, and the real ideological clash was taking place between Alexander Hamilton and the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. After working as a high-profile US diplomat around the world, he felt wasted in the role of vice president. After Jefferson left the cabinet in December 93, however, Washington began to rely more on the counsel of his vice president, who was an expert legal brain, and Adams began to play a more prominent role in the administration. When Washington resigned after 2 terms, John Adams went forward and defeated Thomas Jefferson for the presidency in November 1796. It was a narrow victory, however, with just 3 votes, 71 votes to 68 for Jefferson. Jefferson became vice president because of the Electoral College rules at the time, even though the 2 men were strongly opposed to each other's political philosophy. John Adams became president on the 4th of March 1797. From the beginning, there was tension between the 2 competing wings of the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson, as vice president, represented the more Republican wing of the party. As a Republican, he was sympathetic to the ideals of the French Revolution, whereas for Adams, the revolution was far too extreme and violent. From the beginning of his presidency, Adams was aware of French anger at the terms of the Jade Treaty of 1794. There was a feeling of betrayal in France at the US agreeing a separate treaty with Britain. This violated the terms of a previous alliance in 1778, the alliance between the US and France, whereby France played a leading role in the Revolutionary War. Adams's major focus throughout the presidency was to avoid a major conflict with France, which is a very powerful nation of 30 million people. This was totally in line with Washington's farewell address and his advice to his successors to be aware of foreign entanglements. However, the French Navy were launching attacks on American ships, and Adams sent a 3-man delegation to France to try and resolve the situation. However, this mission got bogged down in scandal as the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand demanded a major bribe before he'd see the American delegation. Two of the American delegation, John Marshall and Charles Pinckney, returned to the US, leaving Elbridge Gerry in France to negotiate a deal. Eventually the scandal, the bribery scandal that is, known as the XYZ affair, became public in the US and turned much of American opinion against France. It also proved to be a major embarrassment for Jefferson and the Republicans in Congress. Attacks on US shipping continued, and this was known during the Adams presidency as the quasi-war period. Eventually, peace terms were agreed with France following the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. The conflict with the French, however, made Adams and Congress more aware of the need for a naval defense of the nation, and they instituted the Department of the Navy during his administration in 1798, with Benjamin Stoddard becoming the first Secretary of the Navy. Adams is often regarded as the father of the Navy as a result of this action. Throughout the Adams presidency, there was a consistent fear of a French attack, and the president signed the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 with this in mind. This was a four-part act which detailed issues like citizenship and deportation. However, Adams lost much popularity as a result of a part of the act which made it a crime to criticize the president and the administration. This aspect of the act was exploited by Jeffersonian Republicans as too authoritarian and contributed to Adams's defeat in the election of 1800. Throughout a long political career, John Adams had always sought to create a more just and equal society based on constitutional rights for all citizens. As a founding father, he was involved in the creation of the US Constitution and the Constitution of his home state of Massachusetts. He was a leading figure in many of the important treaties between the United States and other nations. No new states joined the Union during Adams's presidency. The total number remained at 16. The population of the United States had grown to about 5.5 million by the end of his presidency. The election of 1800 was a bruising, brutal affair. However, it was a crucially important election in the United States history, as political power was effectively transferred in peacetime from one party to another. Adams and Jefferson were on bad terms for a number of years after the election. The Jefferson administration sacked many of the last-minute judges appointed by Adams. The two men were out of touch for over a decade. However, they renewed their friendship following the end of the Jefferson presidency, and they both died on the 4th of July in 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams is remembered in American history as a great president and one of the founding fathers of the nation.